And we are working in Luke chapter 16 this week. So we want to say a couple of things to be looking for as we read through this chapter. First of all, Jeff, let's talk a little bit about what we have.
Right.
Basically, three pieces, mainly two parables
Right.
involving rich people.
That's right.
Though I'm not sure how things are turning out for the manager, but the manager of a rich guy
Right.
in the first 13 verses. And then toward the end of the chapter, we have Lazarus and the
A
rich
famous
man.
parable.
And then sandwich in between there, 14 through 18. What do you want to say about that one?
Oh, in the in between? Yeah, I think Jesus is trying to warn the Pharisees, who, verse 14 adds, are lovers of money. So these parables are dancing around their issues. And he brings up the issue of the heart, and the fact that God knows the heart. And the thing that I think, as he goes on to emphasize the law is king and God's law will be affirmed, that little line there in verse 18 about divorce. Why that there?
Seems oddly
It
placed.
seems very out of place in a chapter that so clearly otherwise is dealing with money issues and greed. And
Well, okay, pause right there. Let's say that because
Okay.
knowing these are the three pieces, the two parables, and then
Right.
this section in the middle of
Right.
them. What is the big idea of the chapter?
Yeah,
Let's identify that
Yeah.
for the readers before we can dig deeper.
Okay, I think the big idea, given the parables and everything else, the big idea is basically it has to do with money, with greed, with mammon, and with proper stewardship of what God has given you. The rich man in the later parable with Lazarus, he's in trouble for being a poor steward of his riches. He uses it for himself while Lazarus suffers, and so it has to do with money, mammon, greed on the one hand versus proper stewardship of God-given wealth on the other.
And so I think if you remember that as you go through the chapter, it'll help some of this stuff sort of come together and
Right.
make sense that the ultimate objective of Jesus is talk to us about using our money with wisdom.
Correct.
So that's the big idea through the
Correct.
whole chapter. And so there are some tough things in the chapter.
Yeah.
We can at least identify those. I think a lot of people get tripped up by the fact that Jesus commends the manager here because he doesn't look like a good guy at
No,
all. He's
no.
he's engaged in all kinds of shenanigans.
Right.
And Jesus said, "Yeah, like that."
Right. And I think part of what he's getting at is obviously he's not commending the man's scruples. In fact, there's a lot that we could say about that maybe when we do our text talk next week. And when we do our month's reading in Luke, we can talk about this parable more at length. But I think part of what Jesus is just getting at with this guy is if even a godless man knows when it's wise to quit holding on to your money so tightly, for the sake of a salvation he needs to have now, how much more should the people of God who understand stewardship, God's given us this stuff, how much more should we know when to let go of stuff for God's purposes and our own salvation?
And so, with that thought in mind, that's kind of the idea he's working. Talk a little bit about the middle section, 14 through 18, because I do think people get thrown,
Yeah.
especially that divorce comment
Yeah.
in 18. It just doesn't seem like it goes with everything
Correct.
else going on.
Yeah, I think first of all, the key is in verse 14 to notice, again, if it's disjunctive to us, the fact of the matter is the Pharisees, Luke adds this comment. He doesn't have to. It's even what Jesus says. Luke wants us to make the connection. These guys are lovers of money. So this clearly is meant to sit in between these two parables. That being said, what Luke quotes Jesus saying about justifying yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. Is at the end of the day, this lovers of money, this deep greediness that sits within them, in one sense comes out in other ways in their lawlessness, besides just the greed. And so Jesus uses divorce and remarriage there as a classic example. And we know from other gospels, they were rationalizers of this issue. Or like in Matthew 19, when the Pharisees pushed Jesus on this issue. And so in one sense, what Jesus is saying is, greed is such a spiritual issue that if your heart is not right because of greed, it's going to show in other spiritual areas as well. Marriage and divorce being one of those laws of God that people throughout the centuries have tried to fudge on because their heart is not aligned with God's. So when your heart's not aligned with God on money, you're going to find it coming out in a lot of other areas as well.
Well, and so that kind of gives us an application to think about and carry away
Yeah.
as we work the chapter this week. Our culture certainly is a prosperous and rich culture.
Right.
And so as we read, let's look for ourselves and ponder how we're using our own money. And
Right.
are we doing what we're urged to do here, to consider what God would want,
Right.
and to act with wisdom in the management of our money. So there's an application to be pondering as we read through this chapter together. Hope your reading this week is profitable in Luke chapter 16.